are going through the Dayton and Cincinnati contract to purchase version date May 20th, 2025, section 4. We're only going through section 4. So section 4 is in the current contract, all of page 2. So we're just going to go through that section. Of the changes that were made when this contract was put together, none of those changes have taken place in this contract, but I'm going to go through it nonetheless. So let's start out at line 45. Under contingency of financing, except as otherwise stated herein, buyer shall pay any and all fees incurred as a result of the buyer's obtaining financing for purchase. If the buyer selects financing, if the buyer selected financing option includes a buyer rescission period, the buyer shall close on the loan with sufficient time to hit the closing date, basically. So what's that mean? Sometimes people use a line of credit, something they already have personally set up. And a lot of times in those situations, there is a rescission period of 3 days. If that situation is the case, then you would need to make sure that the funds are available and not entitled to a rescission period. But what you're marking in 48 is this buyer an owner occupied buyer, a buyer who's using it for rental purposes, or other? And if you do check other, then you need to spell out what that is. The next 4 sections, line 49 has to do with cash, line 53 has to do with conventional, line 57 has to do with FHA, and of course then line 65 has to deal with uh, secondary funding sources, hard money lenders, things like that. So if you needed to do cash or conventional FHA, USDA, or VA, or other funding source, you would use that appropriate paragraph. Once you stipulate the financing that you're using, you would ignore the other 3 options. So that's pretty straightforward. If you have questions as to how that should be utilized, you can talk to the loan officer and or your manager. So let's go down to line 69, financing timelines. If the buyer fails to provide written confirmation to the seller that the buyer has completed any and all requirements within the financing time frame as set forth in subsections A through D, which are below, the seller may, at the seller's sole discretion, by written notice to the buyer, terminate this contract as long as written notice of termination is delivered to the buyer prior to the seller's receipt of any such written confirmation. So things that are bold, things that are capitalized, highly important. Once you get clear to close, once your financing's in order, the buyer through their agent needs to notify the seller through their agent, and let's kind of dive into that a little bit. So line 74 through 76 says the buyer's financing qualification letter, sometimes referred to as the pre-approval or pre-qualification letter, upon initial credit check and preliminary information provided by the buyer stating that such qualifications is or is not contingent upon the closing of buyer's other real estate. So let's stop right there a second. If the buyer is not buying this property with a contingency of having to close on another piece of real estate, then you would mark is not. If the buyer is closing and has to close on a separate piece of real estate first, you would mark the box is. Furthermore, it states and is attached. So you're providing something that's attached, like the pre-approval letter, or the pre-approval letter shall be provided within blank calendar days beginning the date of the contract acceptance. Line 77 through 80, the buyer shall complete a loan application which shall include buyer's selected lender with intent to proceed, including payment of appraisal within blank calendar days. As I coach our agents, I believe that putting in 7 calendar days is more than sufficient. What that is saying, though, at the end of the 7th calendar day, the buyer should have paid for the appraisal and the lender is able to produce a letter of intent whereby you would want to give that to the listing agent. It says that within blank calendar days beginning the day following the acceptance contract that date, and will make diligent effort to obtain financing. Within such time frame, buyer shall provide written notification to the seller, naming the buyer's selected lender and confirming that this provision has been satisfied. And then the section, lost track, line 81 through 85. The buyer or the buyer's lender shall provide written notification to the seller that conditional approval has been obtained within whatever you think your loan officer can close this loan in. So if it's 30, it's 30. If it's 40, it's 40. Whatever that needs to be, that's what you would put in there. Conditional approval, I'm at the end of line 82. Conditional approval shall mean that the loan has been underwritten with credit, income, debts, and assets, verified and acceptable to the lender, subject only to material changes of buyer's creditworthiness, appraisal, and marketability of title to obtain prior loan approval, otherwise known as clear to close. Line 86 and 87. Buyer or buyer's lender shall provide written notification to the seller that loan approval, clear to close, has been obtained or waived within so many calendar days prior to the closing, which in my opinion needs to be, I think if it has 5 days, that's more than enough. But that what you're dealing with is not from the acceptance date at this point. You're actually working backwards from the closing date. So that's lines 86 and 87. And the last paragraph there, which is important, lines 88 through 90, the buyer shall make diligent effort to obtain financing and shall provide all lender requested documents to the lender in a timely manner. The buyer is relying on the buyer's own understanding of financing to be obtained and procedures required and processes required by a lender, as well as the legal and tax consequences, if any. So that is section 4 of the Dayton Cincinnati contract.